Well, I'm the type of guy who never settles down. Pretty girls are, you know that I'm around. Kiss them and I love them, cause to me they're all the same. I hug them and I squeeze them, they don't even know my name. I'm the wanderer, yeah, I'm the wanderer. I roam around and round and round and round. Hello and welcome to Choice Conversations. I'm your host, Chris Stefanik. So as some of you may know, a while back I did a parenting podcast with Kevin Geary called Reboot Your Kids. Now, that podcast, we ended up discontinuing it as Kevin just ran out of time. He didn't have the time to keep recording the episodes. They were interview formats, and they ran from like an hour to an hour and a half. And with the work he's putting into his other podcast and the Rebooted Body service that he runs and that he makes his living off of that, he just didn't have the time to have a podcast of that nature. Having said that, he has since started a new parenting podcast that is a much shorter format. He is, because he's so passionate about parenting, this new podcast, the Powerful Parenting Podcast, he is going to answer listener questions, just taking one question per podcast, maybe a 10 or 15 minute podcast where he helps the listeners to work through their issues. So I encourage you to check out the Powerful Parenting Podcast. Really good stuff. In the meantime, I've decided that I am going to put the Reboot Your Kids podcast into the Choice Conversations feed as part of this switching from the Reboot Your Kids podcast to the Powerful Parenting podcast. The old podcasts were taken down on the Reboot Your Kids website, so you cannot get them there any longer. And I thought just for posterity's sake, it would be great to have them available so that they could help other parents going forward. So with that in mind, I'm just going to put them into the Choice Conversations feed over the next few weeks. And if you haven't listened to them, enjoy them. If you have already listened to them in the past, feel free to skip them or give them a second listen. But I just thought I'd give you a heads up on why you're now seeing Reboot Your Kids. All right, well, I hope you enjoy them. Take care.
All right, welcome to episode 1 of the Reboot Your Kids podcast, the intersection of real food, authentic parenting, alternative education, and a healthy lifestyle for kids. My name is Kevin Geary. My co-host is Chris Stefanik. How's it going, Chris?
Oh, I'm doing great, Kevin. How about yourself?
I am doing amazing. So I guess in this first episode, we'll start out with like a little background of both of us. I guess I will start with me. I'm the founder of rebootedbody.com. I'm also the host of the Rebooted Body podcast, and I started Rebooted Body to change the landscape of human health. And the first way that I started doing that was by addressing health from an adult standpoint. And now the second kind of mission of that, or the second side of the coin, is to reboot kids. Because I think if we think about the strategy of changing the landscape of human health, that at some point children have to be addressed, especially since we're seeing childhood obesity epidemics, we're seeing adult onset diseases in children, and frankly, it's just getting worse and worse and worse. So changing the landscape of human health means fixing broken adults, but it also means creating adults that don't need to be fixed. And of course, like you, I have an alternative view of leading children that I believe is important for not just raising physically healthy kids, but mentally and emotionally healthy kids as well. So that's basic of my background. Why don't you go ahead and give yours?
Sure. So I'm the host of the Choice Conversations podcast, and my goal with Choice Conversations was really just to have some really interesting conversations, and I've opened all kinds of topics on my podcast. But two of the topics that are really important to me and that come up all the time is parenting and health. So, I'll have on guests people that have written books about parenting, people that have their own podcasts on parenting, and as you said, these are typically not ones that are in the mainstream, where, in the mainstream, you're trying to get your kids to do what it is you want them to do. That's the model, basically, where, you'd said, let's find a way. There are better ways that we can have our kids be healthy, both physically with their nutrition and the like, and psychologically. And I would add to that, these alternate ways that are much more effective, they're also going to make healthier parents psychologically, emotionally,
right?
Because the eternal struggles you have with children using the traditional model, which is, typically either authoritarian or the permissive model of parenting. And I guess we could talk about a little bit about what those are before we get into what the alternative is.
We'll get into
as
that.
We're explaining the alternative. Those methods are not very fulfilling, not only for the child, but for the parent as well. They're not fun, for one thing. I mean, parenting can be really fun and rewarding, but you have to do it from a different approach.
Right. And we say, we use the word coercive and stuff, a big term that I've been using lately because I think it helps people really get a clear picture in their mind is opposition-based parenting, where we're creating opponents between children and whoever's leading them. It doesn't necessarily have to be parents. It can be teachers. It could be anybody who's trying to lead children. If you're creating that opposition model where the child is now my opponent, then like you said, that's not fun. It's never going to be fun. It's going to be destructive to the relationship overall. So if people have a goal of having a healthy relationship with kids and a very connected relationship with kids, creating an opponent out of them is not the way to do that.
Right. And it's setting them up for failure in their life because they're learning about relationships. They're learning about communication and connection through you. And when they get out into the real world, quote unquote real world there, when they get into the world as an adult and they're having these adult relationships, they're only going to understand what how to handle those relationships from how you taught them. So if you taught them that relationships are a struggle, it's win-lose, that's how they're going to try to handle their adult relationships. So when they're seeking out a partner and they get in a marriage, it's going to become win-lose and a struggle, opposition-based. And when that becomes unsatisfying, which inevitably it does, then they're going to get divorced. And so that's why you see this high rate of divorce. When they get in their jobs, they're either going to have a crappy boss, they're going to seek out somebody who's bosses them around, or where they're in these win-lose scenarios, or they're going to be that crappy boss. So you're not teaching them skills to have good relationships, both with a partner out in the business world, where they they have relationships. Either they are a subordinate to somebody, or they're managing other people and have people that report to them, to have good quality relationships there, and to have good quality relationships with their clients. I've met many people who they come to the table as businessmen where they view their client as an opponent. And
right.
They're not very successful in their businesses, or even just being the client. I've seen many people who, they go to the help desk, they call up support, and it's opposition based. They're the client, and they're like, you're providing the service, I'm paying for this, give me what I want, damn it. And they come from that, and it ends up being a really unsatisfying, what's the word I'm looking for here? An unsatisfying correspondence with the support person, where they're stressed out. A lot of times they automatically make them defensive when you come in with, from an opposition standpoint, and they're not as willing to help you out as they might otherwise be. Where I come in and I'm like, hey, here's a problem. Let's try to work this out together. And I get from people all the time when I'm going to a help desk or a client, they're like, oh, you were so nice about that. Thank you so much. I don't know how often, you wouldn't believe how often people come in here and get angry at me over, an incident like this. So thank you for coming at it. And it's a pleasant transaction. It's a pleasant correspondence with them. So, but that starts in the home when you're a child. We don't teach communication in school. We don't teach communication even when you go off to the university. And by then, it's already set anyway. I mean, language is built early on, and your responses are really set early on, and it's really, really a struggle to change your responses later in life. So by having these win-win negotiations, win-win transactions with your child, you set them up for success in all the relationships in their life.
Yeah, it's important for people to understand that that's exactly what we're talking about here. We're talking about creating adults who don't need to be fixed, who can use connected styles of communication to problem solve. And I think a lot of adults think when they're leading children, well, I will give it a shot at being a team player, and we'll try to work together to solve problems. But in the back of their mind, they know, hey, I'm the bigger person. I have more authority. I have more strength. I have more size, and so on. So if this negotiation doesn't go my way, I'll just resort to force. And kids learn that too. So a child will adopt the same personality of whenever there's a conflict, okay, well, I'll give it a little shot, but if I don't get it my way, I'll just resort to force, because that's what's been done to me, and that's what they do as an adult. So like you said, a lot of people in life will start out very cordial, right, and very cooperative, but the minute they don't get their way, bang, that personality, the switch flips, and all of a sudden they're trying to dominate the other person. And I think that's, one of the cycles we also want to avoid as well. Right.
And to add to that, when you have force as a tool in your toolbox, you know that, if the negotiations break down, I can always bust out my superior size, my power over the smaller individual to get my way. When you've got that as a tool, that hampers your creativity.
Yeah.
You've always got that to fall back on. You're not like, well, that didn't work, so I can just go to that. Where if you don't have that, if you just say, you know what, I'm taking force out of my toolbox. I'm taking coercion out. I'm not going to use it. You're then forced to use your brain force. You're then forced to, you have no choice but to be creative. And okay, that didn't work. That's fine. Let's start from scratch. Let's start brainstorming. How can we solve this problem? Where at some point, I mean, you're just not going to have that same kind of creativity, that same kind of brain power if you've got that in your back pocket.
Right. And you said earlier about, how people seek out people who kind of act like their parents, where they're seeking out, they're perfectly fine with accepting a job where in the interview they kind of detect that the boss is a little domination based and opposition based, and they accept the job anyway, and they're fine with that because sometimes we create this situation where hell is comfortable because we start to know what to expect in that paradigm, and anything that's outside of that paradigm that is actually healthy is scary to us because we didn't grow up with that. We don't know what it is. So we're kind of attracted to the hell. We're kind of attracted to the chaos, right?
Yeah, absolutely. People seek out others who are at the same level of psychological wounding that they are. So that is, if you're a psychologically damaged person and there's somebody really healthy around, it's painful to be around them because their health really triggers, the wounds you have in you.
Yeah, and highlights.
Right. And at the same token, somebody who's healthy psychologically is just not going to be attracted to somebody who's really damaged. They'll naturally, I don't know if it's something that necessarily occurs at the conscious level, but just subconsciously, they're going to end up being more likely to form friends with these people that are healthy than ones that are unhealthy, if that makes sense.
Yeah, absolutely. So this obviously is an introduction to authentic leadership. It is episode number 1, which the reason I think we wanted to start here is because this is the foundation for all future change, right? We could talk about the nutrition and lifestyle components. We can talk about education. We can talk about kids needing sleep and how to get better sleep and so on and so forth. But if we're leading kids in the ways that we're talking about, coercion and opposition based and domination, then we're not going to be able to reach the long-term goals that we have for our kids, which is the things that we've been talking about and a healthy, connected relationship and so on and so forth. So I guess what we should do is start to get into kind of the nitty-gritty of all this. On the homepage of Reboot Your Kids, which is rebootyourkids.com, there is a free book called Without a Fight, The 5 Pillars of Ending the Struggle for Power and Raising Kids Authentically. And this really takes you through the foundation of leading children in a more connected, more authentic way so that you can reach your long-term goals, which are the most important goals. We don't want to reach our short-term goals while sacrificing the long-term goals that we have for kids. So this book is the foundation, and I suggest everybody who is new to this, they go to rebootyourkids.com, they get the book, they read it, and then from there we can start to talk about all of the other stuff. So let's go in and start talking about more of the problems with coercion-based strategies, and then we'll get to the 5 pillars that are covered in the book. So where do you want to start with coercion?
That is an excellent question. I guess, first of all, we should probably talk about, is it really effective, and what is coercion? What is the message you're sending to your child when you use coercion? So the thing that people will say when they use a method like spanking, for example, is they'll say, well, you know what? It works, though. I get obedience when I spank. And what I would say is that really what you want? Because you're getting obedience in the moment. What I would rather see is that rather than the reason to do this is somebody's going to inflict a punishment on me, is that they actually, let's take, for example, one of these health things. So your child, you would like them to, not stay up all night because the next day they could be more challenging, and they're not having fun either when they're tired and stressed out and irritable. So you would want the reason for them to develop these good habits of getting sleep. You'd want that to be because they recognize that, hey, you know what? I actually feel better. I have a better life. Life is more enjoyable to me when I follow a routine that involves getting to bed at a reasonable hour and the like, rather than, well, if I don't, this tyrant that's 10 times my size is going to come in and punish me. That's not going to translate into healthy habits going forward, for one thing. It's among all the other things that are out there, their reason for doing it is going to be extrinsic. It's going to be an external factor rather than intrinsic. And so if that external factor is removed, are they going to go to bed on time if you're not there hovering over them? No. When they get it as adults and they're, there's all these habits, healthy habits you're wanting to instill. If they're only doing it because you're making them, do you think they're going to continue it whenever they're on their own?
Right.
So I think that's a good place to start.
Yeah. So the word obedience is a great, first word to tackle here, because the question is, do we want obedient kids? Obedience to me is just blindly following whatever, an authority tells you to do, or a supposed quote unquote expert. And that can lead to a lot of bad places in life. But like you said, it's not authentic because it's not a buy-in thing. It's not self-discipline. So that's what I would compare it to is, do we want obedience or do we want self-discipline, where a child is doing something because they truly believe in that act? And I think a great way to explain that would be something like hitting. Do you want a child to not hit because they're afraid they're going to get hit? Do you want a child to not hit because they're afraid they're going to get yelled at and isolated? Or do you want a child to not hit because they care about what the other person feels when they hit them, right? That's empathy. So if a child has empathy for another human being, they wouldn't hit them because they don't want this other person to feel pain, physical pain or emotional pain. The same thing would go for yelling at somebody. or shaming somebody. So obedience doesn't achieve any of that. Obedience is self-centered. Obedience is, I need to control my behavior because I'm afraid of what's going to be done to me. And in my eyes, that creates narcissists. That doesn't create empathetic human beings. Empathetic human beings need to be focused on how their actions affect others, not how their actions affect themselves. So I definitely think obedience, parsing the obedience thing is an important aspect of this.
Right. And another thing parents don't consider when they're creating obedient children is other people that the child may end up obeying. So, whenever they get off to high school and there's this peer pressure around, or probably even before that, they're going to start obeying whatever the dominant personalities are in these classrooms. And now all of a sudden they might not be obeying you, because at this point you no longer have power over them. Once you reach this point, which is another problem with the whole authority thing, is at some point you no longer have power over your child. You only have that when they're small. The more every day they get older, every day they're more independent and more capable, they need you less and less, and you have less and less power. Well, when that gets to the point where it crosses that tipping point where they're like, you know what, you don't have power over me, and you've created someone that's obedient, and they're now obedient to this person that's at their school who's maybe into drugs and partying and all these unhealthy things. I mean, now how's that obedience working out for you? Is that really what you wanted? So there's that component. And another thing that really is a dangerous message to be sending by following this model where the child must obey you is you're telling the child, I don't trust you to make good decisions. You don't know how to run your life in a manner that's you need to be told this by other people. And that is really, really tragic as far as the damage it's going to do to their self-esteem and to their confidence. By telling this child, you're not capable of making good decisions over and over and over again, which is what parents do when they give these, mandates from on high, and they dictate how the child should run their life. And they really run their household as a tyrant, as a dictator. So, those are some other points that I think are really important to consider. If you're an authoritarian parent and you're really questioning, I don't know about this stuff that Chris and Kevin are talking about.
Yeah, and another one is problem solving, that it erodes, because if you are sending that message that, hey, you're not qualified to make this decision, hey, you're not skilled enough to make this decision, you don't have enough experience to make this decision, they are not in a habit of thinking critically about issues that they run into in life. They're not in a habit of thinking critically about solving problems. They're going to learn to default to whoever the authority is. And, it creates a pretty weak adult when an adult goes through life saying, I'm not qualified to do this, I don't have the skills to do this, I'm helpless, I need everybody who's above me to tell me what to do, and so on and so forth. I mean, that's not the type of adult that we want to be creating. And I think that's another side effect of that.
Right. Yeah, that really ties in a lot with what we see in these, we had mentioned the workplace, the people that they're worker bees. They come in and they take their orders and they go off and sit in their cubicle or, work in a factory or whatever it is. They're minions. And that's really all they're capable of because of this environment they came out of. And I think it also ties in, with the school system. The public school system is very much in this model where your kids are not trusted to make good decisions and everything is handed to them by an authority, is dictated by an authority. And I think the only reason why the public school system has been tolerated, why there haven't been a revolt, is because it matches really what they're doing at home. So at home, they don't trust their child and to make good decisions, and they're dictating what the child does, and there's not hardly any free play or scheduled time, because we have to dictate to the child how to spend their day, because otherwise they would play video games and eat candy bars all day. And that's really not true. I mean, your child can make good decisions if you have set up the environment for it and offer them guidance and work with them through these tactics of leadership and win-win negotiation.
Yeah, I think it's important to set up the idea that kids do well if they can. And kids want to learn, and kids want to do the right thing, and they want to do what's best for them. And they're going to realize that eating a bunch of garbage is not what's best for them, and sitting around playing video games all day long is not what's best for them. That they want to pursue education naturally. They want to, quote unquote, grow up. They want to do these things. They don't want to sit around and be a couch potato. They don't want to destroy their bodies and their health. They don't want to destroy their life. They don't want to be nobodies. So our job is to see that, recognize that, and then just provide the environment where that can take off and not suppress that. I think a lot of times the authoritarian model, the coercion model, the do what I say and only what I say and only when I say it, we're not trying to make a replica of us. We need to allow the child to do their own art, right? And put their own stamp on the world. And we do that by providing as much autonomy as possible and enough room for mistakes and error as possible, because that's really the best way that children are going to learn. I think a lot of times people are stuck in this mode of, instead of preparing the child for the path that's ahead of them, they prepare the path for the child, and they make all the decisions, and they don't let the child ever make mistakes. And it's just this idea of like building tunnels for kids where they're just stuck in it. There's only one direction to go, and there's no tangents, and there's no exploration, and there's no anything else. It's just, here's the path I've laid for you. This is what you need to go down. And if you start to stray from that, I'm going to yell at you. I'm going to put you in timeout. I'm going to hit you or whatever.
Right. And of course, your only alternative to this, being the authoritarian parent, is, well, I guess I just got to let them walk all over me, right? So this is what the common reply you hear when you start bringing up these criticisms about how you're making obedient children, and do you really want that, and how pleasurable is it for you to be in this power struggle all the time, etc. Well, otherwise you just let them walk all over you. And certainly there are a number of parents who go with this permissive style, is what it's been labeled. Mm-hmm. Permissive parenting, which is essentially just anything goes. You don't discipline the child. You don't offer leadership. The child just gets whatever they want, and that's how conflicts are resolved. You want to call that resolution. And this is not a healthy way to do it as well, because then the child learns to walk all over people. They're going to seek out people that are doormats, and they're going to end up being not very nice people to be around, being assholes, basically. Mm-hmm. And it's, of course, not very pleasurable for the adult who's sitting there, and this little person is walking all over them. Their needs are not getting met, and it's very damaging for the self-esteem of the adult. And so that's, there is something else. People think that it's really, there's authoritarian or permissive. Yeah, that's a false dichotomy. There is another way, which is where everybody's needs matter, both the needs of the parent and the needs of the child, and you look for solutions to meet everyone's needs.
Right. And, there's a flip side to that too, of being a passive or a permissive parent, where, you pointed out that kids can learn to dominate that type of personality. Kids can also mimic that personality too. They can grow up into somebody who just adopts that exact same personality, where they allow everybody to walk all over them. So that can kind of go both ways. And that's why I like the word authenticity, is because it's about being an authentic person. It's about being a leader and not being either extreme, and having principles that you stick to. You know, authenticity is a principled life. If I have the principle that I don't hit adults because it's somehow wrong, I can't then say, well, but I can hit kids because they're smaller and I have some sort of authority over them. That breaks the principle. It's an inauthentic decision. If I wouldn't yell and scream at my boss, why should I yell and scream at my child? That's inauthentic. So I think that's why the word authentic, people use peaceful parenting, people use all different sorts of terms. And that's kind of why I've been drawn to the authentic term, because it really spells out the principles behind these decisions that we're trying to make.
Right. And when your emotions are elevated, like, for example, if you're angry and you're yelling at your child, you end up, well, for one thing, you end up making a lot of decisions that you might, taking actions that you later regret. But I think it can often be inauthentic in that you get caught up in a lot of surface level things, where if you really look at the needs that lie beneath that anger, okay, let's not look at the surface. Let's dig down a little deeper. Why is it that I'm angry right now? And you can address these needs. And the same thing with the child. It ends up becoming much more real. It ends up becoming much more authentic than being caught on the surface, where you end up in this game of, you know, who's going to win? Who's right? You know, there's this back and forth of, well, you know that you were supposed to pick up your stuff, and you know we've had this discussion a million times, blah blah blah, and then the child's back blaming the parent. Well, I just got through the door. You know that when I come through the door, I'm supposed to, you tell me right away. My first thing I need to do is this, and and there's this blame, and the people are not looking at, okay, what's really going on inside me? Why am I upset right now? Well, instead, what they're doing is, how can I blame the other person? How can I end up being the one who's right in this scenario? And it's not very authentic. It's all about surface level bullshit that is not getting you anywhere.
Yeah, and we do this with adults too. But another example I thought of while you were talking about that was going to bed on time. So, if an authoritarian sets a 9 o'clock as your bedtime, and a child is playing with a new toy, and let's say this is a toy, like maybe a strategy toy or a puzzle or something like that, and it's been requiring a lot of thought from them, and they've been involved with it for 15 or 20 minutes now, and that 9 o'clock time, rolls around, and the parent's like, 9 o'clock, go to bed, and the child is asking for that, just 5 more minutes, 10 more minutes, and the adult, the authoritarian, is kind of taking that as a challenge, like, how dare you disobey? It's 9 o'clock, it's time to go to bed, rather than, like you said, really looking at the feelings and the deepness that's involved here of a child who is really, really motivated to do this challenging thing in front of them. They put a lot of time and effort into it, and we're just completely dismissing all of that and pretending as if it doesn't exist to fit this arbitrary model of a 9 o'clock bedtime. So the adult now has no empathy toward the child and what they've been working on and what they're trying to accomplish and what they're trying to learn. It's just all about this clock that says 9 o'clock, therefore my orders get followed.
Right. And this whole strict thing where the parents are like, it's 9 o'clock, well, just 5 more minutes. No, it's 9 o'clock, it's time to go. That's going to lead to scenarios too. The child's going to learn that, where when you're kind of in a rough spot and you could use another 5 minutes, the child's not going to be willing to give it to you. They've learned that no, we said we go now.
Right.
Maybe you need to take let me think of a good scenario here. You promised to take the child to the park, and you really need 5 minutes, or you're like, boy, we really need to stop at the store and first, there's this thing I need, and then we'll go to the park. Would it be okay if we do that? If we stop at the store first? How lenient do you think the child is going to be if you're never giving that child any leniency?
Right. And now they're going to have a meltdown and exactly.
Right. I mean, what you want is goodwill in this relationship. That's what all good relationships have, a lot of goodwill. There's a store of goodwill there. This is something one of my friends, Anthony Samaroff, he has the Progressive Parenting YouTube channel, and he's been on my podcast before. He talks about this, that one of your goals in parenting should be to build up a store of goodwill as much as possible, because it's just going to make these little road bumps that come along in life so much easier to deal with. The child is going to be willing to extend that goodwill to you whenever there's a road bump. So, make that one of your goals. Can I add a little to that store of goodwill today? If the child wants another 5 minutes to do this because they're really enjoying that, what does it matter? Sure, give them some leniency.
Yeah, and I would also I would challenge adults to turn this on themselves. If an adult is working on an assignment for their job and they've set a goal for themselves of going to bed an hour earlier, let's just say 9 o'clock, right? And 9 o'clock rolls around and they're not done with this project that they really desperately want to get done. I mean, how many adults really would just pack everything up and go right to bed versus giving themselves that extra little bit of time to finish what they're working on? So they'll extend to themselves what they refuse to extend to their child. And it's really dehumanizing. It's like, well, this smaller person, they don't really need that. I decide what they need, right? Whereas I would give myself what I feel I need. But for some reason, we can't extend that to this smaller person over here. And that's something I really challenge people to think about. And one of the pillars of the book, which we'll get into in a second, is integrity. And it's about kind of scoping out the hypocrisy in our parenting, where, why would I do this for myself? Why would I do this for my friend? Why would I do this for my boss and refuse to do it for my child?
Right. Yeah, I like that integrity pillar a lot. So, an example, and I think you even gave an example like this in your book, was if your wife, per se, were to knock over her glass at the dining room table, would you start screaming at her and be like, "Oh, you're such a klutz. I can't believe you did that. Go clean that up this second," Where that is a common response, where there's yelling or belittling or shaming when if a child were to knock over a glass, and it's not to mention the lack of integrity, and you're holding the child to a higher standard than the adults,
right?
The children, that's continually you see this. The irony in all of this is they actually are the least capable of handling their glass out of all the people at the table. They're the ones that are still growing into their bodies. They have the least coordination, the least amount of experience. They've not reached for a glass and picked it up and pulled it to their lips successfully nearly as many times as any of those adults sitting around the table. All those adults have had a lot more practice. And so they should be given the most leniency, but they're given the least. And yeah, the lack of integrity in that, the lack of awareness, which is another one of your pillars, mm-hmm. that they're even doing this. Most adults, that doesn't even cross their mind that, hey, I'm much more lenient on myself, my wife, the neighbor, anyone else, even other kids, than I am on my own child. There's a lack of awareness there. They're not even aware that they're lacking integrity.
Absolutely.
It's two pillars coming together on you there.
Yes. Yeah, and the same goes for hitting too, right? So it's like the people use this excuse, well, they need to be taught, right? Or they should know better. So that's why they hit their child, to punish them for something, whereas they would not hit an adult in that situation, and the adult is factually the person who knows better. So the child isn't the one who should know better. The adult should actually know better, but we wouldn't hit an adult when for some reason we would choose to hit a child. So that's really, let's get into the pillars now, because I think this is a good segue. So we already talked a lot about empathy, and I think the core of that is we want children to be empathetic, because that allows them to make the best decision for themselves and for others. But before that happens, the parent must have empathy for the child, and the parent must have empathy for other people in the world, because the child is going to be watching how the parent interacts with other people. So parental empathy is really where it all starts, and then from there, children can develop empathy as well. And I see that as like the foundation. That's the bedrock, right? If neither person has empathy, then they're not going to be willing to stick to principles, because they just don't care.
Right. Yeah, it's something that is really lacking in our culture, and it's because it starts at the family. People aren't raised with empathetic parents, and so then they go off in the world and are not empathetic with their partners, with their own children, certainly, and the like. And it's such an unfulfilling life. If the times, if you can think back on a time when somebody really gave you empathy, maybe you were hurting, or maybe you were experiencing joy, and somebody else, gave you that visibility, acknowledged it, and empathized with where you were coming from. Just think about how good that felt.
And how connected you felt.
Right. And so it's just so important to teach this to children. It's probably, the simple, most important tool for achieving happiness in your life and having quality relationships, is being able to empathize with others and being able to empathize with yourself.
Yeah, so that takes us to integrity, which is the second pillar. And what I would say to this is, like I challenged people a moment ago to really scope out the hypocrisy in their lives and scope out the job that they are doing as role models for their child. If I don't have integrity in the decisions that I make, then I can't expect my children to have integrity either. But the second piece of that, it ties into empathy, because a lot of parents will say, oh, well, of course, I do things that are hypocritical, but I have the best interest of my child at heart, and I am the authority, and I'm just doing what's best for them, right? But if you have empathy, then you can't live a hypocritical life, because you care about the feelings of others, and you're not willing to break the rules. You're automatically have more integrity. So I think a lot of people say that they have integrity, or they recognize that they have some hypocrisy, but they excuse it away because of their position and because there's this some idea that they're doing what's best for somebody else. But if you're not living with 100% integrity, if you're not willing to really call yourself out for things, then you're not going to be an effective leader.
Right. Yeah, and that integrity, it starts with, if there's a principle that you're applying to your child, universalizing that. So it's like, okay, I don't hit others, so that means I'm not going to hit my child. That's my principles are universal. And of course, it also extends into things like keeping your word and like. So, if you make a promise to your child, I will bend over backwards to keep this. Now, there's going to be times when you can't, and you really need to sit down and apologize when something comes up that you're not able to keep a child, and really explain it to them. And they're going to be upset sometimes if you're not able to keep a promise, and you need to empathize with that. Where you'll see sometimes parents will have they'll have a promise, and then they'll have to break it because something comes up and they're just not able to do it. Mm-hmm. And they haven't built up that store of goodwill where the child, really understands, oh, it's okay, I understand, we'll go to the park tomorrow or whatever. They haven't built up that store, so the child gets upset. And then rather than empathizing with the child being upset, that they get upset then, and they're like, "Oh, you ungrateful little, I bend over backwards for you. I did this, this, and this. What about, we went to the park 3 days last week, and here something really important comes up today, and you're selfish, and rather than, yeah, I know that's really upsetting. You really had your heart set on that. That's got to feel bad. And what happens is when you empathize with someone, and they're experiencing high levels of emotion, it drops the emotion level down. They're like, yeah, you're right. And then once the emotion level drops, they're able to then start reasoning and be like, oh, it's okay, Dad. I guess, we can go to the park tomorrow. But if the emotion levels are high, it's hard to get to that space. And when the other person's not recognizing that your emotion level is high, they're not going to drop. They will probably just escalate.
Yeah, and the wall stays up, the defenses stay on high. So you really are never accessing the full emotions of your child. You're never seeing what they authentically feel because they're too busy trying to protect themselves. And a lot of times kids will get to the teenage years and parents will wonder, why do I have no connection with my child? Why is my child unwilling to share anything that is emotional? Why aren't they willing to come to me with their problems? And if you look back and see that, well, they were never treated with empathy. In fact, most of the time their emotions were seen as illegitimate and shut down. Well, now, they don't feel comfortable. They don't feel safe coming to you. And that's really, when we talk about long-term goals, that's a great example of how using authoritarian style parenting or coercion, any of this stuff to reach your short-term goals, that's what you're destroying later on. You're destroying that connection, and that connection is probably the most valuable thing in your life.
Right. Yeah, when you find yourself reaching into the tool bag and searching around for that coercion hammer, you ask yourself the question, what's more important, obedience in this moment or the health of the relationship?
Right.
Is it worth damaging the relationship to get obedience in this minute? The long-term health of this relationship, is it worth more than obedience in the short term? And it never is. It never is. So that's the thing that people, I guess, they just don't ask that question, or they don't realize, at least at a conscious level, how they're damaging the relationship by following this model. And it's really, it saddens me when I look around and see it in the world.
Yeah, that should be the litmus test. And what that requires is the next pillar, which is self-awareness. So being aware of how you're talking to your children, be aware of how you're acting in front of your children, how you're relating to your children, how you're communicating with your children. And really, as a parent who is self-aware, a child learns to become self-aware as well. And I know we've all seen these people in life where they're acting in such an unacceptable way and they don't even realize it. And it's because they lack that self-awareness. I think if they saw themselves on a videotape or they heard themselves on an audio recording, they would be shocked at how they're behaving. But in the moment, they have no self-awareness. And I think, when we're talking about authentic leadership and having integrity and having empathy, if you don't have the self-awareness, if you're not aware of what you're doing and the behaviors you're carrying through on, none of that other stuff is really possible because you're blind and deaf to your own actions.
Right. I think it was Richard Grove on the Tragedy and Hope podcast who coined the term stimulus response machines.
Mm-hmm.
Basically, if you're not aware, if you lack self-awareness, you just become a robot. You're a stimulus response machine. So what will happen is somebody will do something. There'll be emotional reaction to that, and you're lacking control. You're lacking choice. You then there's an automatic response. There's no freedom there. You're literally just a programmed machine. And it's one of the reasons why I chose to name my podcast Choice Conversations. It has the double meaning there of hopefully the the times when I'm having these discussions with people, hopefully they're relatively high quality, but also, we're promoting awareness, and that, hey, when an emotion rises up, have the awareness to say, to pause for a second, insert a space in there and say, okay, now my programming is telling me to start yelling back, because I'm getting angry right now. But I have a choice. I can choose if I want to yell back or if I want to take a different action. So let's give ourselves choice. And, I had mentioned earlier in the conversation, when people get upset, when their emotions are high, they will often make decisions. They will often take actions that they regret later. And this is that chance to put that choice in there and stop it from happening preemptively. And it starts with awareness. I mean, that is huge. It's the difference between being a stimulus response machine and actually having real freedom in your life, having the freedom to make choices.
Yeah, and I think I actually made a video on this at Rebooted Body. If they go to rebootedbody.com/TV, that's my YouTube channel. And there is a video on this. I forgot what it's called, but I think a good action step for people to take is to change one simple part of their language. You hear this all the time where a parent says, and it actually doesn't need to be a parent, all adults for the most part say this, "You're making me angry," right? And it's a way, it's a statement that allows the parent to not take responsibility for their own emotions. Because the truth is that nobody can make you feel anything. Somebody can, there's an input given by somebody, and you feel anger due to that, but they're not making you feel angry, because somebody else in that situation may not feel anger at all at what this person is doing or saying. So the fact that you feel anger is something inside of you that has to be acknowledged and that has to be accepted, and how you respond to that is under your complete control. So by saying you're making me angry, it's almost like saying you've done this and I have no choice but to give you the response that is bubbling up inside of me. And it's completely allowing this person to let themselves off the hook, rather than, like you said, acknowledge what you're feeling and take responsibility and accept that you have control for what you're about to do next, right?
Right. And I think it's worth looking at this one a little closer for just a minute, because people really question. They're like, really? Somebody can't make me feel this way? So here's an example. I could be sitting here at my desk and my wife comes home. And let's just say she comes through the door and she doesn't come over and say hi or give me a hug, and she just goes off upstairs and does her own thing. One day she might do that, and I might be a little annoyed. I'm like, boy, that was kind of cold. She could have came over and said hi. We haven't seen each other all day or whatever. And another day that could happen, and I might be busy with something, and I'm like, man, I've really got my full focus on this, and I don't want to break it. I'm at the cusp of solving this problem I've been working on for an hour, and let me just get through this. And it could be like a relief that she didn't come over and distract me. And it's a really positive thing that I was able to continue working on it. But absolutely nothing was different in those scenarios on her end. She just came in and walked upstairs. So those responses, one very positive, positive and negative is probably not the right term, but one where I was happy with her actions the one day and I was unhappy with them the other day, that was all on me. It had nothing to do with what she did. She didn't do anything different. So that's just kind of an example of how people don't make you feel things.
Right. Yeah, perspective is everything, and understanding is a lot too. So I'll give another example where a boss is yelling at somebody, a coworker, and let's just say he's yelling at me, right? So if I am very emotionally intelligent and I have a boss who's standing here screaming in my face about whatever, it doesn't really matter what the subject is, but I'm looking at this person having empathy for the state of mind that they're in, understanding that the level of emotion that they're displaying probably has very, very little to do with me or anything I did, right? I am not going to necessarily fire back with anger of how dare you yell at me and scream at me and embarrass me and all this. I may not feel any of that. I may feel just empathetic towards what's happening in the moment, whereas somebody else who doesn't understand that their boss's screaming has nothing to do with them could feel an extreme level of embarrassment and lash out or completely run away from the situation and act as if their boss caused that in them, right? So it's the same situation, the boss acting exact same way, but two different people who have two different perspectives on what's happening feel completely different about it.
Right.
So I think, acknowledging is just the key, and being aware of yourself and others and taking responsibility.
Right. Yeah, and I would like to just add into this as well that realizing that people can't make you feel things and that you're responsible for your emotions and the other people are responsible for theirs. It's not, you didn't make them feel that. There's who knows what's going on in their head. That doesn't mean that now any behavior is excusable. So we'll just stick with this example of the boss. You might feel like it's not acceptable for this person to be screaming at you. Well, in the moment, I certainly would. In the moment is never the time to deal with it. In the moment is the time to be empathetic. That's absolutely the case. But when things are calm later, maybe a week later or whatever, you could approach your boss and say, for me personally, I'm not okay with someone getting in my face and yelling. What can we do about this? Is there something we could do so that this doesn't happen again? And basically what you're doing is you're very explicitly stating what your boundaries are.
Right.
So you can definitely have boundaries and still be empathetic and authentic and have integrity. And in fact, I think that's a part of being authentic is very explicitly stating your boundaries, what you're willing to tolerate. And if people are going to step over these boundaries, you're explicitly stating what your actions are going to be then. Where it's inauthentic to keep those boundaries in your head, and then when somebody steps over it, too many times, and it's like, okay, well, I guess I need to end this relationship or whatever it is, and it's coming out of left field for the other person because you didn't let them know that they were stepping over your boundaries. So it's actually by declaring these explicitly and making it known, it's being authentic, and it sets it up a scenario where things don't have to be personal. Emotions can be a lot lower. Your emotional level can be a lot lower. You can just say, if somebody does continue to step over a boundary that you stated, it's nothing personal, and you say, well, we talked about this. We had an agreement, and the agreement was that if you continue to yell at me, I was going to leave. So this isn't a surprise. We already agreed to this. So, no, there's no need to get upset, for me to get upset over it, whatever. It's basically, it's like having a contract.
Yeah.
In the contract, every contract out there, at least if they're a good contract, has written into it what happens if these stipulations are not met. Both parties are agreeing to do this, and if one party doesn't do their part, if they don't hold up their end of the agreement, then this actions are taken. And just making that known, this is how you can have these pillars in your life and not have people walk over you, and do it in a way that is healthy. And you can model this to your children, and then they're set up in their life to where people aren't walking over them, things that they're not really that they don't find acceptable. They have a method for dealing with them in their life, and you're setting them up for success.
Yeah, I think authenticity is about putting needs if we're going to maybe sum it up and just give a visual, it's about putting needs on a level playing field. So it's not, me succumbing to everybody else's needs and foregoing my own. It's not me being a narcissist and only caring about my needs. It's putting everybody's needs, including your children's needs, on a level playing field and seeing how can we create win-win situations. Instead of creating opponents, how can we create a win-win where everybody feels like they mostly got their needs met and nobody's walking on anybody else. And like you said, if we go back to the example with the boss, if somebody believes that their boss made them feel angry, well, that's going to create a situation where they have animosity towards their boss. They feel obviously their emotions aren't under their control. So now we have to avoid the boss, right? Because if I don't avoid the boss, he's going to make me angry again. And I have no control over that, which means that they're far less likely to do what you said, which is a week later, walk into the boss's office, express your needs, express your boundaries, and create a contract. That's never going to happen if people feel like their emotions aren't under their control, because it's going to create that opposition mindset where now the boss is my opponent and we'll never come together on any of this. We can't have a contract. I just need to avoid them. I just need to talk bad about them at the water cooler to make myself, feel better, and so on. And so it creates all of this drama that everybody claims they hate, right? But it's like, how do we get out of that paradigm? And I think this is the way.
Right. Yeah, that opposition, that there's enemy images, as Marshall Rosenberg refers to it, the founder of nonviolent communication. When you have these enemy images, it's pretty much the exact opposite of that store of goodwill I was talking about.
Right.
So when you have a store of goodwill, there's leniency. There's willing to give the benefit of the doubt to somebody. When you have an enemy image, you're very quick to jump to the negative, jump to, he's trying to get me. I think he was do you see the way he looked at me? I think he was snickering at me or whatever. And meanwhile, there was nothing there.
Yeah. It
was literally, now it's the opposite, where instead of the benefit of the doubt, I don't know what the opposite of the benefit of the doubt would be, but it's now you're finding opposition. You're seeing opposition everywhere because you view this person as your enemy.
Yeah, absolutely. All right, so let's recap a little bit. Pillar number 1 is empathy. Pillar number 2 is integrity. Pillar number 3 is self-awareness. And now we'll do pillar number 4, which is patience. And I think patience is just it's a key thing, again, because we can have empathy, we can have integrity, we can have self-awareness. If we don't have the patience to find solutions, because often solutions take time. Authoritarianism is very quick. It's you hit, boom, we're done here, right? You isolate, boom, we're done here. It's very quick, and I think that's why people are very drawn to it, because it seems to get the job done very quickly, whereas empathy and integrity and self-awareness, and we're going to get to the next one, which is negotiation, these take time, and we have to work with other people. We can't just get everything we want in the exact minute we want it. So if we don't have patience, a lot of this stuff is going to start to fall apart.
Right. Yeah, that's where people try these strategies we're talking about and fail and give up and revert back. It's they expect the strategy to work right away. I just mentioned nonviolent communication. It's a great tool for increasing your self-awareness and having empathy for yourself and for others. And I've talked to a lot of people who tried it and it failed. And they said, that didn't work. I tried it and it didn't work. Well, it's going to take some time to learn these skills. It's going to take some time to solve these problems. And especially when you're new to it, when you've been your whole life in one paradigm, you've been in the win-lose paradigm, and now you're switching over to this win-win paradigm, you're not going to be good at it initially. And so there's going to be some failures. And in order to get past that, in order to reach that goal at the end of the rainbow, it's going to require patience. And I would just say to people that are like, oh man, I don't know, but that authoritarian, that's so quick, and you're sitting here, you're telling me it's going to take time and I don't really have patience. I don't know that I can do this. It does take time on the front end. I think it takes less time on the back end.
Right.
Because you end up you avoid so many struggles by building up this reservoir of goodwill by, learning, negotiating these things up front, and that every day. So, an example might be the child is making a mess in the house. Maybe they leave their toys out, or, their jacket's on the floor right when they come in the door or whatever. If you're in the authoritarian model, you might be at the case where, like, every day you're having this confrontation
till the age of 16.
Right. And it's stressful, it's unpleasant, puts everybody in a bad mood, and it's a minute every day, or two, on the bad, the minute is the day where you like yell at them and they go do it. Then, the bad days are where they're like, no, I'm not going to do it, and then you're in this power struggle, all right, get in timeout, or you're putting them over your knee or whatever. That's over and over and over again, where if you sit down and you have this win-win negotiation with the child where you're empathizing with their side and you're teaching them to empathize with your position of why it is that what need of yours isn't getting met when they leave their stuff just laying out. And then you reach a solution that's acceptable to everyone. Now it's most of the time you don't even have that struggle anymore. It's like, okay, now they're hanging up their jacket. Is it going to be perfect? Or are there going to be some days where maybe they leave something out? Sure. But it's not like every day. It's not, So I think it's a lot of time up front. It's an investment, if you will, up front that then pays you dividends down the road and less time down the road.
Yeah, it's like a company who needs to train an employee where, and I don't know how good of an example this is, but you spend a lot of time up front showing the employee the ropes, creating the contracts, this is how we act here, and so on and so forth, and you end up with a person who eventually is like running a whole division of the company by themselves, and they are the manager of themselves, right? They don't need a manager. They don't need anybody telling them what to do. They're making the best decisions for the company. They're growing the bottom line. They're doing all this stuff on their own because you hopefully have led them in a way where they have autonomy and they understand, basic morality, and they have empathy for themselves and others, and they have integrity and they have self-awareness. So you're creating an asset. Whereas if you take this authoritarian approach, the entire time they're under your roof, 16, 17, 18, 19, 20 years, it's going to be a constant fight every single year, right? Because you're not providing children what they need to be successful on their own and to empathize with your needs. And like I said, the constant power struggle of, instead of just having a level playing field and trying to get everybody's needs met, we're constantly having the child figure out how they can tip the scale in their favor, and the parent trying to figure out how they can tip the scale in their favor. And it's, like you said, constant struggle. So on the front end, absolutely, takes more time, requires more patience. On the back end, it creates a very harmonic situation.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And you're going to have this relationship with them far beyond the time when you have power over them.
Right.
I mean, your power, it's dwindling. From day one, it starts dwindling. You start off with absolute power, and it just gets less and less. But
the more protein you give them, every time you give them a piece of protein, there goes your power.
Right. And I mean, at some point, you absolutely have no power anymore. Maybe while they're still at home, they're 18 or whatever, you still have some level of power, but at some point you don't. Well, I mean, I'm going to turn 40 this year. My daughter's 8 years old. I don't know about you, but one of my concerns with health, and that being, one of my goals of being really healthy, is I want to live to 100. I don't really see a reason why I can't. That's another 60 years. Well, 10 years from now, my daughter's going to be 18. Mm-hmm. That's another 50 years after that I plan on having this amazing relationship with my daughter. Now, if I've been a tyrant over her this whole time, what kind of relationship is going to be left by that point? I mean, there's so many people, if they have a relationship with their parents at all, maybe it's they call them once a week or once a month, and they're like kind of dreading it, like putting it off, and I'm like, oh God, maybe they're only doing it because they feel guilty, and it's not a pleasant experience, or like going home for the holidays. Oh, I gotta go, this is some obligation. I have to do it. Can't wait till I get back. I guess I'll do it and get it over with. Is that really what you're aiming at? Or are you aiming at, my mom and dad are my best friends. Right. I can't wait to go live with them. Or I can't wait to go visit them, rather. I mean, my daughter now, when we talk, I mean, she says, do I have to move out when I become 18? Why can't we just keep living together? I mean, you and mom are my best friends. Why wouldn't we keep living together? And I say to her, I'm like, look, if you don't ever have to move out if you don't want to, I'm sure at that point she's going to want to move out. But
yeah.
but it's building that relationship where it's not this this power over dynamic, and the relationship is the most important part. And you've now have somebody who is such a positive in your life, that you really have this close relationship, this close friendship, that, let's face it, it's impossible to have the same kind of relationship that you can have with a child. The possibility of the relationship you can have with your child is greater than it is with any other person you can have in your life. And you're ruining that opportunity if you're not putting the relationship first, if you're using these other tactics that are just so tragic.
Yeah. Before we get to the last one, let me just ask you this. So, kind of what would you say to parents who have this idea that they'll fix it when they get there? So, when my child turns 18 and I'm ready to have this connected relationship with them now for the rest of their life, I will just explain that everything that I've done to them was for their best because I love them and I had their best interest at heart, and they have to understand that I did this even though I didn't want to. I didn't want to do this to them, but I had to do it because it's what they needed, right? And now I'll just somehow magically repair the relationship and create this intimate connection out of thin air when they turn 18, so that we can be happy for the rest of our life. But I'll be able to get what I want in the short term.
So the first thing I would say to that is, I would say, how is that working for you and your parents? Do you have this relationship with your parents right now? Do you have a relationship with your parents that you want to have with your children? I would bet most people to that would say no. And so there might be some exceptions. And to those that are exceptions, I would also add, look, when you look at the relationship you have with your parent, that's a pretty small sample size. We're doing a scientific experiment there. Mm-hmm. Look around at your friends and family as well. When you've seen that model followed, how's it worked out? Are they having relationships with their parents, the kind of relationship that you would like to have with your child? So for me, I don't see any reason why your child shouldn't be your best friend or one of your best friends. When you look around at people that have used these other methods that will fix it when they're adults, how many of them would put their parents among their closest of friends? And if they wouldn't, why wouldn't they?
Right.
They were there from day one, and had the opportunity for this person to be closer to them than anyone else has that opportunity, because they were there literally from day one. Nobody else is there with you from day one, except your parents. So, I guess a sibling could be there as well. If you have an older sibling, they were there from day one. But is that what you're seeing? When you look out there, how is that working out? And I'd say most people, their closest friends are not their parents. Most people, their closest friends are somebody where they're an equal. Mm-hmm. They don't have a power over relationship. That was never part of the equation. They have a really easy rapport with each other, and they treat each other as equals. They don't, when there's a problem arises, they find a way to solve that problem in the relationship without resorting to coercion. Those are the relationships that people value the most, that they keep coming back to. These are the ones that they call, this is my best friend. It's the ones that they have a really warm feeling when they think about that person and really look forward to them. They're like, when the phone rings, am I like, oh, just can't wait to pick it up, and you feel lighthearted and a smile on your face before the phone's even to your ear? Or is it when your mom calls and you look at, oh, my mom, should I answer this? Maybe I'll just let it go to voicemail. So look around. How is that working out?
Absolutely. Okay, let's get on to the last one. Pillar number 5 is negotiation. So I know there's a lot of people who are saying, well, all right, well, how does this work? How do we get things done? Because if I had to negotiate with my child about everything, there's going to be no time in the day for anything else, right?
Right. Yeah. It's one of those things you just have to. Well, ideally, if you started with this from day one, it's as things come up, you're going to negotiate through a solution, and then for the most part, it's done.
Yeah, you kind of have that contract, right? Where
if
this happens again, well, let's just default to the contract we had before.
Right. No, I mean, there might be times when you need to, as in all relationships, in all contracts, you might need to revisit them. This contract no longer is really working for us. Let's come up with a new one. But in general, you get the answer and then you're done. If you've already started, if you're a parent and your child is 12 or your child is 8 or whatever, there's going to be an adjustment period. But if you empathize with the child, use some of these strategies like nonviolent communication and the like, it gives you a groundwork to pretty quickly get answers. I mean, using NVC, you can usually get an answer in the short term. Like if you're like, okay, we don't have time to sit down and negotiate. We've got a commitment where we're supposed to be at somebody's house in 15 minutes, and there's some kind of conflict. Nonviolent communication can give you the tools to solve a conflict in the short term and in the long term. I think you can usually sit down, empathize with the child, come up with something, negotiate a solution, and then, okay, we'll look for a contract. We'll look for some kind of longer term arrangement to this problem later. I mean, that's how I've viewed it in my life. I know that I can use MVC when I don't have a lot of time to get a short term solution, and then just say, we'll revisit this later and see if we can find something that's a little more satisfying. And going back to that reservoir of goodwill, the more goodwill you have in your relationship, the easier that's going to be to say, you know what, here's an acceptable short-term solution. I know it's not what we want long-term for this, but because we have this goodwill, we're both more willing to accept this in the short term and move on, knowing that we'll revisit it later, if that makes sense.
Yeah, absolutely. And another thing I would challenge parents to think about is negotiating in situations that don't really require a negotiation. So I'm going to give example of a child who doesn't want to put their coat on to go outside when it's cold. So the parent has decided you're going to put your coat on because it's cold outside, and the child, because they have no autonomy anywhere else in their life, is now going to make a stand here and say, no, I'm not going to put my coat on. I want to go outside in the cold, right? And the parent is saying now, oh, how dare you challenge my authority? And now we have to get into some sort of struggle and punishment and so on and so forth. So if a parent is thinking about, okay, well, so you're telling me I need to negotiate in this situation where I need to find a way to talk my child into wearing a coat, right? Well, that's not really a situation that requires negotiation. If they don't want to put their coat on, then they don't need to put their coat on. Let them walk outside. There's a natural consequence of being cold. And what I would suggest if they start complaining about being cold is to then empathize with their situation and show how, okay, well, this is why I asked you to put a coat on, but be very empathetic towards how they're feeling. They made a mistake because now they're complaining about their decision, right? So that also doesn't require meanness or shame or any other form of control. You can just be empathetic. And I believe that by facing that natural consequence of being cold, next time they're just going to willingly put their coat on before they go out the door. It's just a way that life kind of teaches us things. And as a an authentic leader, we have to allow that to happen sometimes. We can't just put our foot down and say, well, I know you're going to be cold and I know you're going to end up complaining. I don't want to hear you complain. Therefore, we're not leaving the house till you have a coat on, right? And that's just not a situation that I think needs to be negotiated.
Right, right. Yeah, there's a concept that was life-changing for me when I first was introduced to it. I was reading the book Parent Effectiveness Training from Thomas Gordon, and the concept is, okay, when you have a problem, identify, is this the child's problem or is it my problem? It's a real simple concept.
Right.
And most parents think they're the ones to solve all the problems. But they said, if it's the child's problem, let them solve it. Just stand back, let them solve it. And you're going to avoid all these conflicts. You're going to avoid these needs to negotiate. And also, something else I mentioned earlier, you're going to teach the child that you trust them to make good decisions. You know, if you're always making decisions for the child, if you're stepping in and solving their problems, you're telling them you're not capable of solving this problem yourself. I have to do it for you. And their self-confidence goes out the window at that point. So you're really helping to build a healthy child that is confident, that is good at problem solving, and the whole time you're meanwhile avoiding getting into conflicts and having to use negotiation because you're letting them solve their own problems.
Right.
So,
and I think framing, how you frame it is important too. I'll give an example that just popped into my head, and we could apply this to the coat example as well. But when my daughter was 18 months old, even probably before then, and we'd put her in a high chair, she would start to get bored at the dinner table, and she would stand up in the high chair. And of course, you know, standing up in a high chair is not the safest thing to do, especially if it's not stable and the floor is pretty hard and there's not going to be much cushioning if she falls. You know, I think I've seen a lot of parents, you know, grab an arm and force them to sit down, or say, sit down right now, or no standing, or they make this arbitrary rule that there's no standing. And I've never done that. So the first thing that I tried, which I was extremely amazed at how well it worked, but I just said to my daughter, I said, I'm feeling afraid that you might fall if you stand in the high chair. And she'd look at me for a second, and then she just sat down. And it's like, I didn't even ask her to sit down. I didn't tell her what the solution was. I just said, I feel afraid that you might fall if you're standing in the high chair. And she sat down. And then I've used that a couple more times, and she sat down a couple more times, and now she really doesn't stand at all in the high chair anymore. So it's like how, and going out the door with the coat, I could do the same exact thing. I said, I'm really afraid that if you don't put your coat on, you might feel cold, and then you won't have your coat if you feel cold. And it's just kind of, it's like giving them some information in an empathetic way where they can then have the autonomy to make the decision that whatever they feel is right. Now, if she falls out of the high chair, it's probably only going to happen once. Kids don't like falling, right? So again, natural consequences are going to come into play at some point, but how we frame this, instead of giving orders all the time, we're just communicating, here's what I think about what's happening right now.
Right, right. And of course, when you give them that information, hey, I'm afraid you're going to be cold if you don't take your jacket, then you're setting yourself up for the ultimate reward of the I told you so. Didn't I tell you that?
and it's unspoken too, though. You know, that'll be an unspoken thing.
Right. No, yeah. I'm joking. You don't. That is not what you're setting up there. But,
right.
But yeah, you're right. You are, like, the child knows.
The child, yeah, they're gonna think that in their head, you know, and that's why I said now it doesn't require shame. You don't need to push that in their face.
Right.
They just, now they figured out, oh my gosh, my mom or my dad made a suggestion that turned out to be absolutely correct. Perhaps it would be helpful to listen to their recommendations in the future.
Right. Instead of being resentful that they made me wear this thing.
Yes.
And my parents are so stupid. They're always making me do this, that, and the other. Right. Yep. Yeah. You're setting her up to be a leader, somebody that they would look to as an authority figure, someone they would choose to be an authority figure in their life, because look how many times they've led me down the right path and did it in a way that felt good. It was positive, not like they led me down the right path and kicking and screaming the whole way, pulling my arm as they did it, you know?
Right.
So.
Cool. All right. Well, I think this has been a great episode. We've covered all the 5 pillars. I do want to set people up and let them know what's coming. So episode number 2 is probably going to be, this was, by the way, an introduction to authentic leadership. Episode 2 is going to be an introduction to nutrition and lifestyle for kids. Episode 3 is probably going to be an intro to alternative education. And then we're just going to be off to the races from there. So did you want to close with anything else?
No, I think that was excellent.
Cool.
I really enjoyed it.
Good. So you guys can check us out at rebootyourkids.com. And then if you want to check the show notes or find links for anything, all of the episodes are going to be numbered with 3 numbers. So episode 1 is 001. So you can always go to rebootyourkids.com/the session number. So this is rebootyourkids.com/001 for episode 1. That will contain show notes where you can go back and review. It'll contain links to anything that we mentioned on the show. And it will allow you to join in via the comments as well. So you can leave comments on any episode that you would like, and we may address those in future episodes. We may expand on them. We may create a whole new episode out of a great comment. You never know. So definitely participate. All right, Chris, thank you so much for being here, and I will see you soon, my friend, for another episode.
Sounds good. Take care of yourself.
Because I'm the wanderer. Yeah, I'm the wanderer. Roam around and round and round and round. Take it, Mark. Life without a care. I'm as happy as a clown with my 2 fists of iron, but I'm going nowhere. I'm the type of guy who never settles down. The pretty girls are, you know that I'm around. I kiss them and I love them, cause to me they're all the same. I hug them and I squeeze them, they don't even know my name. They call me the wanderer. Yeah, I'm the wanderer. I roam around and round and round and round. Yeah, I'm the wanderer. Yeah, I'm the wanderer. I roam around and round and round and round. One more time, cause I'm the wanderer. Yeah, I'm the wanderer. I roam around